Hello, welcome to Queset. I'm Hazel Varela. I'm Secretary of the Board of the Ames Free Library, Easton's public library. And we'd like to share with you today a little bit about this house. We will be looking at all three floors, so I would be talking about Winthrop Ames on this first floor, primarily because he was probably the most important Ames who lived here in the early 1900s. This house is called Queset because it's actually built over a river. The Queset River was actually called a mill river and some other names until about 1825. And then it was decided that it would be wiser to have a more classical name. And Bridgewater had labeled this as the Queset River, named for a Native American tribe. And Easton decided to call it Queset. It's a lot easier to say than maybe Queset. But it wasn't really named that until 1825. We're going to start by going into the library. We're going to talk about the architecture and the history of the house on the second floor. We would like to focus basically on this floor about Winthrop Ames, as I said. And as we sort of do a panoramic of the room, you'll see the beautiful paneling, the photographs that have been added, et cetera. And you can just picture Winthrop Ames sitting in this room and enjoying many of the books and the diaries. The books that you will see on the various shelves were actually in the Ames Free Library in the 1880s, 1890s, and they're really from what we might call our rare book collection, and we're hoping that in the future people will be able to come in and do quiet reading here. One of the things that was here about 1920s and 30s were diaries of Winthrop Ames's grandmother, Mrs. Oakes Ames, and in the diary of January of 1865, it talked about Oakes Ames actually going to meet with President Lincoln and talking about a possible transcontinental railroad. Unfortunately, when people started to look for these diaries in the 1960s, most of them had vanished. But just envision Winthrop Ames sitting here enjoying the diaries of his grandmother, Mrs. Oakes Ames. It's a beautiful place, and again, we have one of the busts that Truman Bartlett did of Oliver Ames. This is Oliver Ames, the second Oliver Ames. He was the first president of the Union Pacific Railroad, and obviously with his brother were very much involved in the Ames Shovel Company and also in regard to the Union Pacific Railroad. It is he who, in his will, left $50,000 worth of stock for the creation of a public library. So it's very fitting that we do have this Bartlett here because this building is now owned by the Ames Free Library. So if we can just enjoy the beauty and the quietness, and obviously you can look out on the landscaping, et cetera, that added to this, eventually designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. We're going across the hall now to probably what was considered a living room. This is where there may be more active conversation than there would have been in the library. And we do have portraits that I want to point out. First of all, we have Mrs. Winthrop Ames, Lucy Fuller Ames, and I need to tell you about her. She's a very fascinating individual, and before your tour ends, we'll talk about her more. This is Winthrop Ames, and basically he was born in this house. I'm assuming he was born here in Northeastern, and he will eventually inherit this house in 1899 when his father, Oakes Angier Ames, dies. So Oakes Angier Ames will have this house built. We'll talk about that a little more on the second floor, and then it becomes Winthrop Ames's home. As I'm sure most of you are aware, Winthrop Ames became an outstanding Broadway producer. And from about 1905 or 6 until 1930, this was his second home. He had a home in Long Island because he was producing plays. He actually built 2 theaters. One was called the Little Theater, which only had 300 seats, and then the Booth Theater. But as we take a look again at the design, we can see obviously the beauty of the outside. The architect, Andrew Jackson Downing, is famed for combining home and landscape. And we're looking out at a garden, which I will talk about in more depth subsequently. All of these different sconces that you see have been replaced because this house was totally vandalized in the 1960s. Each of the rooms will have obviously a fireplace. There's no central heating in the 1850s when this is built. Winthrop Ames went to Harvard, and this is obviously one of the class reunion pictures, 1934. He graduated from Harvard in 1895. And this is an entranceway. I'm going to show you the other side of it in a few moments, but this will be actually a rope-pulled elevator because Winthrop Ames becomes ill in 1930 and retires really to this home until he dies of cancer in 1936. The other side we'll see in just a few moments. Now, if we go back to the hallway, this is a picture of Winthrop Ames, probably here taken at Queset. Once Winthrop Ames came home to stay, if we can use that term, in 1930-31, he became very interested in his family genealogy. This is a book that he wrote. It's called The Ames Family of Easton, Massachusetts. And he felt it was very important to share with the other family members. This was sort of a private memoir. And it's an interesting book in that he becomes very interested in the Union Pacific development and the role of Oakes and Oliver Ames. When Winthrop was 11, he actually walked with his father up to the dedication of the Oakes Ames Memorial Hall. And everybody at that tribute paid great compliments to Oakes Ames. And as he walked back with his father, Oakes Ames said to him, "Your father, your grandfather, was a very special man, and you should take pride in him." And at first, Winthrop thought that maybe his father was just over-exaggerating. But one of the things that he did in the latter part of his life through this book was to actually research everything about the Union Pacific and reach the conclusion that his dad had been right. This was a private printing. Inside it says 1938. And what we find is that this was reprinted by David Ames in 1985 because he felt that other people should have the opportunity to read it. And actually, this particular copy was given to me by David Ames, so it's autographed inside to me. All right, we're now going into the room.
We'll take a break for a second. I'll just walk out of that room. So.
Okay. This again would be Winthrop Ames's study room. Notice that it's not very large. English cottages were designed so they would be comfort, and I think as you look a panorama of the room, it's a cozy one, and you can just picture a desk here, and Winthrop Ames working on that book that I just had the opportunity to show you. After his death, this may have become the flower room. It was typical in most Ames houses that there was a flower room on the first floor. And this is where those flowers grown in the garden would be brought in. And I have to show you the other side of that elevator. You'll notice that it's not too deep. It obviously is a storage space now. And we think that basically it was a pulley kind of setup where one of the servants could actually physically move the elevator up, almost like a dumb waiter. Mr. Ames, the last few years, was in a wheelchair most of the time. Whether that wheelchair would have fit in, I don't know. And conceivably, on the second floor, there might have been another wheelchair. But again, one of these beautiful rooms in this English-style cottage. Here we see a few of the pictures that I'm going to be talking about subsequently. This obviously is a layout of the outside of the house, and we'll talk about Downing style subsequently. This is a picture of the pool at the time that Winthrop Ames lived here. Now, Winthrop Ames basically spent the theatrical season in New York. But on long weekends, he would come back to Queset. Queset was very important to him and his family. And so he frequently would invite guests. We do know Catherine Cornell was here. We know George Alice was here, and others. And that he had this pool created. Actually, it's an Italian garden, which we'll talk more about. And this obviously is the front of it. And when you come, you'll notice that right above where my thumb is, or my finger is, that there's an Ames family crest. It's the 3 roses diagonally. And you'll find that at Borderland and a number of the other Ames houses. We're now getting into the dining room. It's probably one of the most elaborate of the rooms. If you'll notice the ceiling, which had to be restored after the vandalism occurred. Again, notice it's a very cozy room with a lot of glass, so you have the opportunity to enjoy the outdoors. Now, Winthrop Ames was very interested when in his theaters, the Little Theater and the Booth Theater, of having a combined series of activities or plays. Children's plays. He rewrote Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and actually had it produced there. Probably the first of the children's programs that were actually done as a theatrical presentation. Gilbert and Sullivan operettas had sort of faded away, and again, he's very active in restoring them, besides a lot of the Greek dramas. The Little Theater, which is West 44th Street, and Booth Theater's West 45th Street, basically, he was able to manage 2 theatrical presentations at the same time. The Little Theater will be bought by the New York Times in 1931 when Winthrop Ames retires, and eventually it's used for instance, Dick Clark's programs, David Frost's programs, et cetera, by CBS. And then it becomes called the Winthrop Ames Theater. And in 1983, it's going to be renamed the Helen Hayes Theater. And it has just again been bought, and it's supposed to reopen under a new title in 2013. But again, notice again the extraordinary amount of light, which was very unusual maybe in a lot of the houses built at that time. And again, you can look out, if we were here as one of Winthrop Ames's guests, at his Italian gardens. And we can also, obviously, at the angle I am looking at, see the library. This is one of the maps. Actually, if you're interested in a copy, we do have them at the Historical Society, but basically of what Northeastern looked like near the end of the 1800s. And again, the importance of the water system, because the Ames Shovel Company was originally powered by the dams. And water from Queset, which would have flown underneath here, was part of that water system. Some of it came from what you and I would call Long Pond, and the other tributary would be actually Queset. Again, any of the sconces that you see have been replaced because the original ones were totally vandalized. We're now going to walk into the pantry. And sometimes this would be called the butler's chamber. In other words, this is where the very famous Wedgwood and other kinds of glassware would be stored. And hopefully there would be a nice ladder that one could climb to get to it, because I'm always amazed that I looked at this pantry or the one at Borderland of the shelving, which is far above my head. What would you say, this 10 feet? This is a good 10 feet. So you can just picture all of the very fashionable plates, Wedgwood, et cetera, that would be here. Now, the original owner, Oakes Ames, who had had this house built in the 1850s, decided he needed more room. And so this back part is added in 1873 by John Ames Mitchell. John Ames Mitchell is a cousin of Oakes Ames, and it is he who is responsible not only for this addition, but he's going to make changes at Langwater, and then obviously, as we all know, is responsible for Unity Church. When he finished Unity Church, he realized that even though he was a relatively young man, that he had achieved his goal, and so he becomes interested in publishing and is responsible for the first Life magazine. And many people know him as a publisher or an editor and didn't realize the architectural work. This is the part that basically is added. Even though it says, please do not enter, I do want to take just a couple of moments and indicate that we have a Friends of the Library. They run book sales, and these are some of the samples of the books that you might be able to purchase the next time. Here's James Patterson, always very popular. These are arranged quite effectively with basically fiction, nonfiction, et cetera. And they are very, very generous to the library based on, obviously, their fundraising, et cetera. I do want to take a moment and tell you a little bit about Mrs. Winthrop Ames. Her name was Lucy Fuller, and Lucy Fuller was the niece of Margaret Fuller, who was the great activist here in Massachusetts. And Lucy Fuller marries Philip Cabot of the famous Cabot family in 1902 at the age of 20. And they have two daughters. And by 1906, 1907, Lucy has decided she's going to divorce Philip Cabot, which might even be called scandalous. This was a total shock. We have newspaper articles at the railroad station, which basically Philip Cabot is in total shock that his young wife wants to divorce him. She will actually go to South Dakota. Her parents lived in Walpole, but they also had property in South Dakota, and she was actually born there in 1882. She will go there in 1907 and 8 and get a divorce. But South Dakota was like maybe Nevada of today, and the divorce was not recognized here in Massachusetts. She will get a second divorce, if you want to use that expression, here in Massachusetts from Philip Cabot. Mr. Cabot, just for your information, was an expert in public utilities, and he becomes a professor of business at Harvard College from 1920 on. Did he marry again? Yes, but I think it's very interesting. The divorce was final from Lucy in 1911, and he does not marry again until 1937, marrying his secretary, and he will die Christmas of 1941. Now, the most surprising part of this story is that most people did not know that Lucy Fuller Cabot knew Winthrop Ames. And yet, they both were in London in late 1911, and they got married. That was the surprising news, because most people were not aware that these two very interesting people knew each other. So again, you can see somewhat maybe the brick, maybe of the original exterior of this before John Ames Mitchell added to it. I don't know if you can hear some noise, but they're working on putting in an elevator here. The noise is in the cellar. And I might indicate that before the dam broke at Flyaway in 1968, I was in the cellar, and I'll explain why later, and I had to take a big jump to go through the river, across the river. In other words, where I'm standing in relation to that blue chair, that was the width of the river. And fortunately, I guess I was much more agile then than now. Now there's no evidence of the river there because the dam did break in '68. Okay, we're going to walk out towards the corridor again. Restrooms here. There's an elevator that's going to be put in within the next month or so. The back stairs that the servants would use. And again, restrooms and a kind of parlor for the ladies to use as part of the restroom. Before we go upstairs, I've mentioned several times that this house was vandalized. When I was asked to come in 1969 and look at it by a realtor, the thing that hit me the most was several things. First of all the windows had been broken, and therefore, basically, the windows were covered, or the frames were covered by cardboard or boarding. All the sconces over fireplaces had been ripped out, chandeliers had been destroyed, but someone had wanted this mahogany and therefore had brought an axe. And so in 1969, right about where my hand is hitting, was the indentation that was caused by an attempt to remove this. Obviously, they weren't successful. Okay, we're now heading to the second floor. Again, notice the beautiful staircase, etc. And we can look back and, again, see the beauty of that dining room and, again, the outside. These large windows enable us to look out the family, and basically his older brother, Hobart, will have built a house which was taken down after both Mr. and Mrs. Hobart Ames died. But you might probably, on a winter day like this, be able to see the house that was there. This is a print that was made and given to the library by Frederick Lothrop Ames, who lived at Langwater. And not only is it an excellent copy, but the type of frame this is makes it extremely valuable, the frame itself. The second floor would be primarily for the family. Lucy and Winthrop have two daughters, Catherine and Joan, and probably the master bedroom would be here. And again, notice the amount of light, which was very unusual in an 1853-54 home. We have a little bit of a mystery about the architecture. Andrew Jackson Downing is given credit for the creation of this home. It was built in 1853-54, but Mr. Downing is going to be dead by July of 1852, and I'll explain a little more about that in a moment. As we walk along this, you'll notice again the indentations. This is furniture that was left by Forest Systems. This room is what I would call plain but elegant, the way that it's structured, and you can picture it as the master bedroom. We look out, and one of the concepts that Jackson introduces is the porch. Porches really didn't exist before really the middle of the 1800s. And Downing's theory was that not only is a house important, but the landscape is important. And how do you combine the landscape and the house? You have a porch, so people can sit outside and enjoy the beauty. They may have had separate bedrooms, which very often might happen, or this conceivably could be the dressing room. It's similar to one that's at Borderland. In other words, you'll notice that there are several closets here, and there was a tendency, obviously, to keep your spring clothes or fall clothes maybe in one closet and winter clothes, et cetera, in another. So that my assumption is that this is the dressing room as opposed to a bedroom, which we just looked at, which is a lot larger. And one of the things that you'll notice is the amount of closet space, which very often did not exist in a house that was built this long ago. This room, because of its size, conceivably could have been what we call a morning room. In other words, this is where the servants might bring coffee, etc. Again, it's cozy, it's small, but again, you've got great light. For those of you who are as old as I am, you'll probably recognize that this used to be in the library. This is part of the card catalog, which all of us used very faithfully so many decades. I have several pictures here. First of all, the colored picture, and one of the things that Downing does is you'll notice it's a rectangle, but it's irregular kind of rectangle. And this is a Downing almost statement. He's one of the first to use this almost zigzag kind of exterior, giving more light, etc. Now, this is strictly a Downing technique. He became recognized very early in his career as a landscape architect. In other words, the combination of the house, a lot of windows, and remember, glass is a lot more expensive than very often the building material. And here again is the porch, where one could sit and enjoy the beauty. Now, because he recommended this new phenomena in the 1840s, he became known as sort of the architect of American landscaping. He wrote in an article in the 1840s that there should be a park in New York City. And it's one of the first times that the concept of Central Park was mentioned. In 1850, he went to Europe, actually went to London, And there he met a gentleman named Calvert, V-A-U-X. It's supposedly pronounced like Hawks, so Vox. Mr. Vox and Andrew Jackson Downing established such a relationship that Mr. Vox is going to come here and stay with Andrew Jackson Downing in Newburgh, New York. They will work together. They become partners. Andrew Jackson Downing worked on the landscape at the President's house. We call it the White House today. He worked at the Smithsonian. So this young man had established quite a name for himself when in July, late July of 1852, he took his family on a cruise on the Hudson, nice summer cruise, steamer. The steamer exploded, and Andrew Jackson Downing and his family and almost 80 other people died. So he's passed away by 1852. This house is built in 1853-54. So it's probably a combination of Downing and Mr. Voy, V-A-U-X. Mr. Voy meets Olmsted, Frederick Law Olmsted, and they become great friends, and it's assumed that they collaborated on Central Park, although I think you and I always assume that Central Park is strictly Olmsted. So the gentleman that Andrew Jackson Downing brought from London is really the intermediary between Downing and Olmsted, and probably doesn't get the kind of credit that the other two gentlemen do. Hopefully, each of you has been able to get at the Northeastern Savings Bank a copy of this community calendar. It's actually from September of 2012 to August of 2013. But it has various pictures of the restored Italian gardens. Also, I'm going to ask the gentleman who's filming this at the end if he might be able to close up, because there is actually a website, actually it's YouTube, where it shows the two children who were born to Winthrop and Lucy growing up. And it basically will show the children enjoying the garden and basically Hobart Ames's estate in 1928. Again, notice again the closet space. I think we women always like to have a lot of closet space, and I'm always impressed by how much we find here. Now, in regard to this house, it's lived in by two generations of Ameses. Winthrop Ames is the second one, and the first one I'll talk about on the third floor. And then basically, after Lucy decides to use it only part-time, it's going to actually eventually become returned to the Ames family, and a Spalding will be in charge. They rent this for several people, and we will find that for a period of time, there are a sufficient number of people who are interested in renting this. Again, this is a setup that was used for a period of time. And as you look out the window, again, you can see, obviously, the stage. We do know Winthrop Ames had Midnight Summer Dream performed there in the 1920s. We also know that the Class Day was always celebrated there. And Mr. Ames would try to be here to watch the performances, and there were several Eastern young ladies whose talent he thought was excellent, and he would invite them with their parents' permission to actually go to New York, actually stay with Mr. and Mrs. Winthrop Ames, and have a chance on Broadway. One named Bettina Hall, who grew up in Union Street, is an example of someone who was identified by Winthrop Ames as being a very capable actress. By the mid-1950s, Mrs. Ames was no longer living here, although Lucy Ames will live until 1968 when she dies of pneumonia. her daughters will marry, and therefore there seemed to have been less interest in this house. By the 60s, it was owned by actually Winthrop Ames's sister Catherine's family, Spaldings. The Spaldings lived in the DC area, and they really weren't interested in this house very much, therefore the vandalism occurred. And what will happen is eventually it came very close to be torn down. Not only was it being vandalized, but it was being used by teenagers as a weekend retreat, if you want to use that expression, and I'll show you the rooms where there were some real problems. So the Spaldings were encouraged to try to sell it. No one was interested in buying this in the late 60s, $75,000 with acreage, but you're buying a house that has antique electricity, antique plumbing, no windows, and not in very good condition. Because they weren't able to sell it, their only option was really to have it torn down. So if you can look out this window at the driveway leading from Main Street, just picture a wrecking crew right there where there are cars on the left-hand side. Fortunately, 3 people, Elise Ames Parker, who grew up at Sheep Pasture, now at Unity Close, David Ames, and Oliver Ames of Beverly Farms paid, first of all, the wrecking crew to have 2 days vacation, paid the Spaldings $75,000, and became owners of this house. Mrs. Parker then put in $100,000 worth of obviously windows, electricity, plumbing, etc. And for a brief period of time, the teenagers seemed to appreciate all the great heat that existed. And it was actually used for a period of time by the Jacobsons, David and Patricia, who live at the Canary House. And after they moved to the Canary House, Mrs. Parker offered her son, Bill, her great-nephew, Bill, this house for $1, William Ames. He was stunned. He will tell you about coming here with a mattress and hearing haunting noises. And he and subsequent people who owned this actually had this area where we're standing right now almost as a studio apartment. In other words, to make sure there was somebody here. There was a kitchen facility, there's restrooms there, etc. So this would be a studio apartment, which was used by a variety of people over the next really 20 years. But that was to ensure that there would be someone here who would be responsible for making sure that it wasn't being vandalized. These are really the back rooms. Again, we're assuming that when Catherine Cornell and others visited, their bedrooms would be the ones, the last 2 rooms that we were in, the one that had the card catalog and this particular one. This area is currently rented by a producer named Kevin Friend. And I'd like to share with you, as we climb to the 3rd floor, a story that Kevin Friend has just been told. Kevin Friends, who has been in film producing for a period of time, had connections with the Bruins, etc., was recently told by an acquaintance that there's a very good possibility that the Babe Ruth trade was signed here. In other words, Harry Friends, the owner of the Red Sox, needed money for Nanette. And he had a star pitcher/hitter in Babe Ruth. Keeping in mind he's a theatrical producer who obviously would know Winthrop Ames because they share the same love. Conceivably, the agreement may have been signed or discussed at least in one of those front rooms where we were when this program began. So whether that's true or not, it's an interesting story. The third floor, again, there are several large rooms here at the front, which again might have been used for special guests, but most of it would have been used for the servants, et cetera. And you'll notice the built-in bureau drawers. And again, storage space. This is a picture of Oakes Angier Ames. It is he who had this house built in 1853, using definitely the plans of Andrew Jackson Downing. Whether they actually met or not, we don't have documentation, although we're still looking for it. Also, Mr. Vaughn, Mr. Downing's successor, should also be given credit. Now, he is the oldest of Oakes' sons. This is Congressman Oakes, et cetera. And he knows that his future, as he's growing up, is going to be that he's going to be president eventually of the Ames Shovel Company. It had, by tradition, gone to the oldest son. It was developed by Oliver the First. Oakes will be the second generation. Oakes Angier Ames, the third generation. And so he had this house built just before he married Catherine Hobart in 1855. The listeners may be interested in the fact that if you stop to think about, from the Rockery beyond Unity Church was bought by the original Oliver Ames. So the next time you drive or walk by, keep in mind you have Oakes Ames Memorial Hall, you have the library, you have this house, you have the Antrim Hammer Shop, you have obviously Unity Clothes, you have Unity Church and the parsonage. This land and the cemetery in back, this land was all bought by Oliver, the very first Oliver Ames. So you can envision Oakes Angier Ames, realizing that this is where his livelihood is going to be, will have this house built. It's as close to the shovel works as one can get. It will be here that there are 6 children born, only 4 of them live. And I will have a genealogical chart to show you before the end of this tape. He will inherit with his younger brother, who becomes governor. They're part of their father's shovel company when Dad dies in 1873. Although he had been doing a lot of the work beforehand because his dad was in Congress, was involved with, obviously, the Union Pacific. So Oakes Angier Ames, the person who had this house built, was very much involved with the shovel company way back in the 1850s. It will make shovels for the Civil War, and we find that they actually started in 1865 to use steam. Before that, it was all water power. And through his entire lifetime, until he dies in 1899, they used kerosene lamps. Now, how important was the shovel company? When Oakes Angier Ames was president, 60% of the world's shovels were actually Ames-made shovels. Even Queen Victoria got a patent right from Oakes Angier Ames. And I'm sure all of us realize that there's no heavy equipment in the 1850s to the 1890s. So shovels are used for canals. The Erie Canal, 350 miles, was actually hand dug, mostly Ames shovels. The Transcontinental Railroad had to have the railroad beds dug, Ames shovels, and railroads throughout the country. And actually, Park Square, one of the early subway stations, was hand dug by Ames shovels. Now, this would be another one of the units that was created first by Bill Ames, and then Bill Ames will sell the property to his dad, David. David Ames will sell the property to Douglas King, and there were people that actually would rent this, and this again ensured that somebody would definitely be here. You've got your kitchen set up, et cetera. Forest Systems, which eventually will buy this from Mr. King, will obviously modernize it. But again, you've got a nice sunny room. This could be a pull-out bed, et cetera, and there is a restroom close by. And again, we get another view of the beautiful Italian gardens. So a very interesting comfort area. With great cupboards, et cetera. And I'm always impressed by the cupboards. This would be the back section when the first two generations of Ameses lived here. And again, this would be for the servants. Many of the Ames households would employ as many as 10 to 15 servants inside. They would be the washers, the cookers, the butler, the nannies. Some of the children might be homeschooled, et cetera, and they would live here. Outside would be another group of men in charge of the gardens. Probably they would not have as many servants because their main home, particularly Winthrop, was in Long Island. Again, the back stairs, obviously, for the employees. Now, in 1969, when the Spauldings indicated that they needed to sell this property, the realtor asked me to come and look at the house. And it was as president of the Historical Society. And the thing was that the neighbors on Lincoln Street kept complaining to the police that on weekends there were noises coming from this house. Keep in mind the house is unoccupied. Of course, the neighborhood children decided this is haunted. And there's still people who claim that they're haunted today. But when I got to this room, I was a little concerned because I didn't look maybe as properly dressed as I should be, but I was very glad because in this room, I waded through, I think I got about as far as here, beer cans up to my knees. And even though some of these windows were broken, keep in mind it's the third floor, so I don't think rocks can hit that high. The smell of marijuana permeated this room. And in fact, the local cleaner, who always does an excellent job, indicated that I really should not wear those clothes again, that there was just so many stains from the beer cans, et cetera. So this goes with the story that this house is haunted. And obviously, this is why the real estate person was having a great deal of trouble taking care of it. One final story. I don't know if the sun is going to hit that area that has the little shrubs there. But in Winthrop Ames's day, that was a frog pond. There may have been goldfish in it. You maybe be able to stick your toes in if you weren't too worried about bacteria, et cetera. And in 1952, this house was being used by one of the management employees of the Ames Shovel Company. The last name was Grant. And Mr. and Mrs. Grant had two children, William, who's just turned 2, and a baby, probably just a couple of months old, maybe a couple of weeks. And as Mrs. Grant is diapering, actually, the child, she assumed that William was right beside her. I'm assuming this was on the first floor because very often the tenants would just stay on the first floor and maybe have one bedroom on the second floor. What had happened was that William wandered off and fell into that pool and drowned. Obviously a very horrifying experience for the family. They called the local doctor, Dr. Porter. He was here as fast as he could get here, but there was no hope. So that's really the one tragic story that comes to mind. Sometime in the 1980s, that was filled in. Bill Ames is double checking with Doug King because he believes it was during Mr. King's ownership of this, would be the late 80s and the 90s. What Mr. King would do is obviously have functions on the first floor and rent second and third floors. And he had rented to a company called Forest Systems. It was a land trust company, and basically they were thrilled with this house. In fact, they bought it and used the second and fourth for their offices. And some of that furniture that you saw there was actually left from them. They were bought by a land trust company in California. And for a while, the land trust company still stayed here. But then they got a large contract for Brazil, the Amazon forests. And basically, it was decided to move this branch of the company to Florida. And so this is when, in 2007, the Ames Free Library bought this. It gives us really 3 buildings. We have the wonderful Richardson Library, which has just been restored under the direction of Jay Thomas. We own the property across the street, sometimes called the Pink Cottage, and we're thrilled to rent it to the Easton Learning Center, run by the Gomes family. And so we're really the proud owners of 3 pieces of property, which we hope the residents of Easton thoroughly enjoy. And I hope that the viewers of this will find this informative, and if I've made any mistakes, I apologize. But it's really a fascinating house with a fascinating history of Oaks Angier Ames, who probably lived here all the time. He didn't seem to have any summer kind of retreat. And I'm sure the company was thriving, so he had to be there at all times. Winthrop Ames obviously is not the oldest, and I do have a genealogical chart I want to show you. It's in the other room, et cetera, and explain what happens to the members of the family. Mr. Richardson, who was at Harvard at the same time as Frederick Lothrop Ames, who had the house at Langwater built, was a very great, actually a patron of H.H. Richardson. We have 5 buildings, as everyone knows, but that's probably 10% of what he actually did. There's a count that he did about 50, keeping in mind he never reached the age of 50. I also want to point out that Bill Ames has put together with a cousin a brief genealogy. It's very well done for one of the Ames reunions. This is one done in more detail, and it lists all of the Ames descendants, and it's almost 700 pages. And there is a copy of this at the Ames Free Library, Easton's Public Library, if you want to check anytime on this. And it's just amazing the different generations and how involved they are. I don't know if the last part you want to just take. Just basically, this is, I've got this folded, this is a new chart that's been made. This is the first Oliver, and then we have Oaks, etc. And then we have basically Oaks Angier Ames. And one of the things that I didn't mention that I think is very important is that Father Oaks and Brother Oliver, too, mortgaged the Ames Shovel Company for about $7 million to pay for some of the debts of the Union Pacific or the Credit Mobilier. One of the things that young Oaks Angier Ames, his brother Oliver, who will become governor, and his cousin Frederick, who's at Langwater, would do is in the 1870s meet every Sunday right after church, and they would either come here, or they would go to the governor's house, or they would go to Langwater and work on the financial things that needed to be done. And because Oaks had to stay here, Oaks Angier, he's running the shovel company, it's the governor in the 1870s who was going to Washington or to New York to talk to Jay Gould the next day. In other words, he's sort of the traveling Ames before he becomes a politician. But the 3 brothers, this 3rd generation, basically refinanced the shovel company and it takes off. So there isn't too much said about Oaks and Ames, but it's amazing what he did with the shovel business, with the financing, and really the cooperation of these three Ameses in the third generation. Now, here's the fourth generation. Maria, this is Oaks Angier, they were all born here. Maria is born first, and she marries eventually a doctor, Richard Hart. Interestingly enough, their son, in 1931, will become president of the shovel company. He's the great-great-great-grandson of the original Oliver. Then there were two Oakses born in between, both only lived about a year. Then we have Hobart Ames. He's obviously named for his mother's maiden name. And Hobart Ames is going to be the fourth president. And so he's going to have a house that's built over to the right. And he will become president of the company in 1899. He and his wife Julia do not have any children, and it's interesting that in the will, it's determined that whoever is the second one to die will have the house torn down after the passing of both. However, he and his wife had developed Grand Junction, Tennessee. It's a plantation larger than Borderland, and they raise golden retrievers. In the will, that house or that plantation was left to the University of Tennessee, and it's still in existence today. The third child that survived is obviously Winthrop. He marries Lucy, and they have two children, Catherine, 1999 to 1964. She's in an automobile accident in Reno, and she will actually die before her mother, Lucy. And then we have Joan, 1923, and she lived until 2011. And then the last, or the youngest of the children, is Catherine, named for her mother, and she marries a Spalding, and it's actually her family that's responsible for this house after about mid-1950s, and will actually sell it, fortunately, and not have it torn down. I don't think we should conclude without my sitting very cautiously in an H.H. Richardson chair. You'll notice that I'm not leaning against the back, not very comfortably anyway, because Mr. Richardson weighed about 300 pounds. And you'll notice that anything that is a Richardson bench, like the one on the second floor at Oaks Ames Memorial Hall, is very large. And if I sit all the way back comfortably, you'll notice that I have to figure out what to do with my feet. Not that they're on display, but basically, you can just picture, even if I weighed double my size, which I don't want to, I still would fit comfortably here. And so it's an honor to have a Richardson chair associated with the library. As I said, there's a Richardson bench at Oaks Ames Memorial Hall, and we have a small Richardson chair at the railroad station.